Welcome to CFO in the Know. We are so thrilled to have our Chief Financial Officer, Michelle Myers, here with us today to answer a few questions about our school budget. Welcome, Michelle.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Just a couple of questions for you as we kind of navigate this really interesting time across our country, across our state, and of course here for our school district in Peoria. We know that recently our state passed a skinny budget, and that was something that they did to make sure that we had just some of those essential functions covered under our budget for next year. Wondering if you can give us a little bit of insight as to what is next from our legislature. Will they be reconvening? And if so, what might be considered as it relates to K12 education?
The legislature did pass, as well as the governor did sign, a skinny budget, as it's being called, which is really a base support level budget for fiscal year 2021. And they did that a few weeks ago, in part to address some of the uncertainty with COVID-19. And with that base support level budget, it does include the continued 20% by 2020 funding for our certified classroom teachers, as well as continued inflation restoration. But what it does not include is the accelerated district additional assistance, also known as capital funding. So actually they cut about $64 million from the budget statewide, which means that Peoria Unified will see about $2.8 million in lower capital funding next year. So we've been hearing in the school finance community that the legislature may come back and reconvene, possibly in a special session, to look at some priority bills and different things, but it's highly unlikely that there would be additional funding for K12 at this point. We're a bit concerned with some of the numbers we're hearing from the state. The Joint Legislative Budget Committee recently published numbers that the state is looking at a $1.1 billion deficit in fiscal year 2021. And now that number could go up or down about 500 million. So it's an estimate related in part to sales tax revenues declining. And so with that, we're just hoping that there aren't additional cuts to K12 funding for next year in lieu of seeing anything being added.
Well, we know these are uncertain times and there is quite an impact at so many different levels. Can you talk a little bit about maintenance and operations overrides? And I know those that live in our community maybe are used to hearing that term, but for those who may not know, what is a maintenance and operations override and why are those important to traditional public school districts?
A maintenance and operations override provides additional funding for a public school district's maintenance and operations budget. So the state legislature, as well as state law, allows school districts to ask their community to pass what's called an M&O override that provides additional funding, anywhere from 10 to 15% additional funding each year for the M&O budget that pays for positions and programs. So the majority of the district's operational costs, including salaries and benefits, transportation, fuel costs, those types of expenditures are in M&O. So having an override allows us to fund additional positions and programs. And in fact, a majority of the public school districts here in Maricopa County have at least a 10% override. And Peoria Unified has had an override in place going back to 1996. And we currently have a 13% maintenance and operations override that provides about $27.8 million of additional funding to our budget each year.
So if you can, Michelle, talk maybe a little bit more specifically related to maintenance and operations overrides. Really, what is at stake for our school district if we are not successful this coming November on either sustaining our current override or even increasing our override? What is it that we stand to lose?
As I mentioned, we have $27.8 million of funding each year from the district's current 13% override, which was approved by our local community and voters back in November of 2015. And that override provides funding for a number of positions and programs throughout the district, including staff and teacher compensation, all-day kindergarten, arts and music, education activities, athletics and extracurricular activities, nurses, as well as assistant principals at all of our schools, and reading and gifted programs, as well as helping us maintain our class size. So when we have an override in place, when the voters approve an override for a school district, it's for 7 years. And what that means is a district is required to go back to the community to ask to have that override renewed. So in our case, Peoria Unified has a 13% override. And as you highlighted, we can ask for a renewal, or if our Citizens Advisory Committee and Governing Board recommends a higher amount, that would be the question on the ballot in November.
Well, I know it's quite a process to get to November and to get something on the ballot. If you could maybe just talk a little bit about where we are as a school district in that process and when we might expect to know what will be on the ballot impacting our district and K-12 education.
Well, the governing board reconvened our Citizens Advisory Committee in January, and that committee consists of community members and district employees who evaluate a recommendation to the board to have either a 13% M&O override question or a bond question on the November ballot. And I should mention there is a difference between an M&O override and a bond authorization. An M&O override funds people and positions, where a bond authorization provides dollars for school maintenance, renovation, purchasing buses as an example, or to build a new school. So they're very different, two distinct questions. And so the committee's been meeting since January, and they've been receiving information from administration and outside professionals related to our enrollment and the economy and different factors to consider as they evaluate the recommendation that they'll make. We expect the committee will make that recommendation in May, and that our governing board will consider that recommendation and ultimately call for an election by the second meeting in May if the recommendation moves forward.
So as we kind of wrap up here, I'm wondering if you could just kind of give us, from your perspective as the CFO, how would you characterize where our district is currently financially? Really, kind of where do we stand from a school district, our financial strength?
Well, if you look at our district strategic plan, one of the 4 perspectives within that plan is stewardship of community resources, which is to solidify and adhere to policies and practices and sound accountability for our taxpayers and patrons here in the community. And with that, each year we have annual financial audits and state required financial reporting related to our budget and our expenditures each year to ensure we're in compliance with all of the state level and statutory guidance and requirements that we have each year. And we do our very best to maximize our expenditures in alignment with the limited funding that we do receive each year. We're so appreciative that the funding has started to be restored going back to 2016, but it's important to remember that that restoration's proactive. It's not retroactive, going back 10 plus years where there are some pretty significant funding cuts for all public schools. So we do our very best with the funding levels that we have to optimize our expenditures to ensure we're supporting our students and staff to our fullest ability.
Well, thank you, Michelle. That wraps up today's CFO in the Know. We'll be sure to bring you more updates directly from the school district and, of course, from our CFO, Michelle Myers.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.